There's just something that I wanted to call to you patients' attention, which I'm sure that you've noticed. We do not have room to properly take care of visitors and relatives and friends of our patients. When we are busy, we do not have room for even all of the patients that we would like to care for. And I'm asking each one of you, good friends of mine, all of you patients who are here, that you will not ask us to room and board your relatives or your friends, realizing that it places us to a great disadvantage and much inconvenience.
He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley. He's the man who's the man. He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley.
Now listen, it's the bony part. That's the bony part.
As we look out across the man-made lakes of America, we sometimes wonder what stories lie submerged beneath the waves. This reservoir in the middle of Kansas covers the original site of the small community called Milford. And these steps led up to one of the most powerful radio stations in North America. But the man who built it came to be one of early broadcasting's most well-known personalities. Known to many as the Gland Doctor, Dr. J.R. Brinkley became one of the most controversial figures in the history of American broadcasting. To some, he was a gifted healer. To others, he was a quack and a charlatan. And although he's been gone for half a century now, some still remember how the town changed after Dr. Brinkley and his wife arrived. They came in the fall of 1917.
The reason why they came to Milford was the doctor up there that we'd had for 100 years, old horse and buggy doctor, retired. So my uncle that ran the drugstore advertised in the different papers around the country for a doctor to come to Milford. And Dr. Brinkley answered the ad.
In one of the Kansas City papers, there was an article, there was a town of 10,000 people and no doctor. So we had a Stutz car and we rode out there. And we got there, we got to Milford. There wasn't hardly any town, and there's around 300 or 400 people only. But we laugh and say that's all the gasoline we had, so we stayed. There was a hotel and drugstore kind of combination building, and they were both vacant. So there was rooms in the back of the store, and so we started up housekeeping back in those rooms.
Dr. Brinkley started out in Milford as a general practitioner, delivering babies, treating various ailments. Before long, however, he hit on the idea of a transplant operation in which he was to specialize. He came up with the idea in response to a local farmer's affliction with sexual impotency. At the farmer's insistence, Dr. Brinkley performed an operation in which tissue from the reproductive glands of a goat was implanted in the man. And within months, the farmer's wife became pregnant, and Dr. Brinkley prepared to pioneer a new field of medicine. A man is as old as his glands, he wrote, and his glands are as old as his sex glands.
That Kansas farmer's son, little Billy Stitchworth, became known as the first goat gland baby. Dr. Brinkley presented him as living proof of his ability to restore a man's sexual vitality. Before long, the word of his operation spread, and he performed his transplant on growing numbers of patients, charging a fee of $750. The Brinkleys soon acquired a block of land and built a new home in Milford. Part of the home was devoted to the doctor's office and operating room. As the incoming flow of patients increased, the house was expanded to accommodate them. It was turned over entirely to the hospital business when the Brinkleys built another home next door.
when patients would come there, you could see them. They came on crutches, canes, and walked out like young men. I've seen many of them come in that condition. People who could hardly walk, and men who are very senile. And by the time they left the hospital, they were just like different people. And I can really believe in the goat gland transplant.
What made you select the goat?
Dr. Brinkley was, for a time, surgeon for Swift and Company in Kansas City. And he found out that the goat was the healthiest animal. The Toggenburg, not the billy goat, you know.
Not an Angora.
Manger. Not an Angora. Had to smell to high heaven. No, these little Toggenburgs, and we used them 2 months old. And they were very small. There wasn't too much of it, you know.
The Brinkleys left Milford for brief jaunts to Illinois and Connecticut, where they set up temporary clinics and performed the operation. Early in 1922, they traveled to California at the invitation of Harry Chandler, publisher of the Los Angeles Times.
And he gave him publicity every day. He was out there to operate on the editor of the Los Angeles Times. And that was very successful. And every day Mr. Chandler would report how he was getting along. And of course that brought in, we stayed out there 3 months. And I laughed and said we made enough money, we went on and traveled around the world.
In 1923, the Brinkleys sailed to China, where a friend had lined up more patients. They performed the operation on several Chinese men before continuing their trip around the world. More important than the publicity and income generated by that trip, Dr. Brinkley had encountered a fascinating new technology while in California. In the building occupied by the Los Angeles Times, Harry Chandler was putting KHJ, the first radio station in Los Angeles, on the air. Greatly impressed by this new medium, Brinkley resolved to build his own station when he returned to Milford. On the air in the fall of 1923, Brinkley identified his station as KFKB, Kansas First, Kansas Best. It was the first non-experimental station to receive a license in Kansas, and only the 4th commercially licensed station in the United States. Brinkley called it the Sunshine Station in the heart of the nation. "We want to broadcast sunshine," he said. At first, the programming offered by KFKB consisted mainly of amateur performers from the surrounding area. The 9th Cavalry Band came over from nearby Fort Riley, and musical groups came from local high schools. From Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, professors drove over to deliver lectures in a College of the Air series. Dr. Brinkley took to the air himself to talk about the trips he'd taken or to talk to mothers about the health of their babies. Before long, however, Brinkley employed a number of professional entertainers. He presented his listeners with Uncle Bob Larkin and the Arkansans, the McCree sisters, and Steve Love and his orchestra. Children listened in each day to the Tell Me a Story Lady, and Professor Burt provided language lessons in French. D.D. Denver served as the station's announcer, filling in between numbers and presenting daily weather and market reports.
It was all live entertainment. You could go in there and sit in that studio and watch some of the best entertainment in the world. It didn't come from New York City or Los Angeles. You know, like ABC, NBC, and CBS today.
KFKB became one of the most popular radio stations of its day. Assigned to a frequency occupied by no other station in the country, and broadcasting with a 5,000-watt signal, its programs reached listeners from coast to coast.
Based upon a poll conducted in 1929, Radio Digest magazine awarded KFKB with a trophy, declaring it to be the most popular radio station in America. The station received 4 times as many votes as any other. Its popularity boosted Brinkley's reputation and created a festival atmosphere in Milford, bringing in people from miles around.
Milford was the biggest little town for 250 populations you ever saw. On weekends, boy, there just wasn't a place, there wasn't room to walk. But we used to laugh and say that they called it 250 population. We called that, said it was 250 with the cats, dogs, and the graveyard. But it was on the map.
As demand for his operation increased, Brinkley built a large brick sanitarium. In addition to providing more spacious accommodations, it included a drugstore where the doctor's prescriptions could be filled. This became another aspect of his business that proved to be quite lucrative for the doctor. He carried his prescription business onto the radio in a program called the Medical Question Box. Listeners wrote to Dr. Brinkley and described their ailments. His secretarial staff sorted through hundreds of letters to select those which the doctor would read. 3 times a day, he picked up a stack of letters on his way to the microphone and read them over the air. He then made his diagnosis and recommended one or more of his special prescriptions, which he identified by number. They could be ordered directly from Milford or obtained from any of the 500 druggists in 5 states who belonged to the Brinkley Pharmaceutical Association.
This medical question box was quite a thing. He would say, well, Mrs. A.J., just take Dr. Brinkley's number 11, and so-and-so's drugstore is authorized in your city, and they will fill it for you. Well, the drugstore got a pretty good kick off of it, and so did Dr. Brinkley.
Prescriptions commonly sold for $3.50, $1 of which was to be passed along to Dr. Brinkley. Druggists reported sales increases ranging from $10 to $100 a day. For his share, Dr. Brinkley may have received as much as $10,000 in a week. The income generated by his hospital and his prescription business made a wealthy man out of the young doctor. With patients arriving for his operation from near and far, he paved the road from his sanitarium to the railroad station, which was 1.5 miles outside of town. This was at a time when few roads in the state were paved. It undoubtedly left a strong impression on incoming patients who were chauffeured from the railroad depot by a man called Happy Harry. Not everyone was as happy as Harry about Dr. Brinkley. His success provoked increased antagonism among those who questioned the legitimacy of his practices. 1930 became a year of conflict for Dr. Brinkley. The fight against him was led by Dr. Morris Fishbein, editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association. Newspapers, such as the Kansas City Star, gave prominent display to Fishbein's accusations. He also attacked Brinkley in talks broadcast over WDAF, a Kansas City radio station owned by the Star.
Following Fishbein's opening volleys, the Kansas Medical Society charged Dr. Brinkley with unethical and unprofessional practices. He was summoned to appear before the State Medical Board, but an appeal delayed that hearing.
The citizens of Milford rallied around their embattled leader, and the Chamber of Commerce took out full-page ads in the Kansas City and Topeka papers. But Brinkley's struggles were just beginning. KFKB's broadcasting license came up for renewal at the same time, and the Federal Radio Commission expressed reservations about renewing it. Sensing that his radio station was in jeopardy, Brinkley led an entourage of supporters to the renewal hearing in Washington, D.C. The Radio Commission was primarily concerned with ascertaining if KFKB was operating in the public interest. The Medical Question Box program appeared to be highly suspect in this regard. In addition to reviewing the merits of KFKB's programming, the Radio Commission heard testimony on Brinkley's medical business. After several days of testimony, the Commission voted 3-2 against renewing KFKB's license.
On the same day, the Kansas Supreme Court denied the appeal that would have prevented the state's medical board from reviewing Brinkley's status as a physician. And the board proceeded with its hearings in Topeka.
While Dr. Brinkley's lawyers produced a number of witnesses who praised him, lawyers for the state produced witnesses who had different stories to tell. After several weeks of testimony, the review board traveled to Milford at Brinkley's invitation and observed him performing the transplant operation.
He invited them and they all came and watched him do his surgery. He did 2 transplants for them. Yes, they watched the surgery. And they went back to Topeka
and revoked his license the next day.
The Kansas City Star sounded the death knell for Brinkley. The forces of organized society are inexorably drawing the net about him, it said. The super quack of Kansas is done for. And indeed, it didn't look good for the doctor. In addition to losing his licenses, his personal integrity had been seriously called into question during the hearings. Dr. Brinkley had worked hard to win the trust of his supporters, many of whom still did not believe that he was a quack. They had been convinced that he sincerely believed in his calling.
When my father died, and when he was buried, I stood by his unfilled grave, because when he left, all I had was gone. Mama had died on April 23rd, 1891, when I was just a little more than 5 years of age. And I did not have any brothers or sisters. So when Daddy was gone, everything was gone. And as I stood by his unfilled grave, in my little heart of hearts, I resolved to be a doctor like Daddy was.
Brinkley made frequent reference to his humble beginnings in the hills of North Carolina.
I was born on July 8, 1885, back in the mountains of western North Carolina. And I grew up in those mountains, and when I reached the age of 16 years, I began carrying the mail on the rural pre-delivery route. I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and wouldn't get back until about 7 o'clock that evening. I would go from Tuckasegee, North Carolina, down to the train at Silva, North Carolina. And while I was waiting for the mail, I would spend some time in the railroad office, in the Western Union office. And there it was that I learned the Morse alphabet. I learned to be a telegraph operator and a railroad agent. And it was from that humble beginning that I was able to go to the greater cities and receive an education which required many years of hard work and much effort.
Although Brinkley studied for several years at a medical school in Chicago, his degree came from the Eclectic Medical University in Kansas City. Granted credit for his studies in Chicago, he received his diploma after only a year's study in Kansas City.
The practice of eclectic medicine, however, was not certified by most states. Brinkley and his fellow graduates were sent to Arkansas to take their licensing exams. After passing the Arkansas tests, they could then obtain licenses to practice in other states by way of reciprocal licensing agreements. And it was in this way that Brinkley obtained his license to practice medicine in Kansas. When his license was revoked in 1930, he could easily have moved on to another state. But he wasn't ready to leave just yet. He decided to run for governor instead. "Let's pasture the goats on the State House lawn," he cried.
He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley. He's the man who's the man. He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley.
With only 6 weeks before the election, it was too late to get his name on the ballot. But that didn't seem to discourage Dr. Brinkley. He launched a write-in campaign, the likes of which Kansans had never seen before. He hit the road with a supporting cast of radio entertainers and hospital employees from Milford, as well as the local preacher. His wife Minnie and his 3-year-old son Johnny Boy went along. Campaign ads put forth the image of the family man. Brinkley addressed crowds across the state, promising free textbooks for their children, lower taxes, old age pensions, and a lake in every county. KFKB was still on the air, pending a ruling on Brinkley's appeal of the Radio Commission's decision not to renew its license. It was a powerful voice for his campaign. Other voices were crying out against Brinkley, however. The famed Emporia journalist William Allen White noted with dismay the large crowds that were swelling the ranks of the Brinkley camp. An editorial in the Emporia Gazette conveyed his opinion on the situation.
In every age and clime, there is a great, seething, moronic underworld. Its denizens are literate. They can read and write, but they can't think. They live on the level of their emotions and vote their prejudices.
This enraged the Brinkley supporters. Offended by his reference to a moronic underworld, they deluged White with letters of protest. He responded in print.
Dear Brinkley voters, you got me wrong. I didn't mean that you were wicked. I only meant that you were dumb.
White didn't have much praise, however, for the other candidates in the governor's race. He referred to one as a sap and the other as a sissy. Brinkley's Republican opponent was Frank Hauke, described as a model farm boy from Morris County. The Democrats rallied behind Harry Woodring, a banker from Neodesha. Neither of these candidates exhibited the flair for campaigning that Brinkley possessed. He became a viable alternative for many who were disenchanted with party politics in these early days of the Depression. Brinkley campaigned vigorously under the banner of life, liberty, and justice, putting additional emphasis on his Christian convictions. As Election Day approached, it became more and more obvious that he had attracted enough voters to become a serious contender. Early election returns were encouraging. 12 days later, however, after the longest vote count in Kansas history, Harry Woodring was declared the winner, edging out Frank Hauke by a margin of 251 votes. Brinkley came in third, trailing by 34,000 votes. As many as 50,000 votes intended for Brinkley had been thrown out, however, because election officials claimed those ballots were not filled out properly. Brinkley's name had to be written down precisely as he had filed, J.R. Brinkley, or the ballot was thrown out. Any votes for Doc Brinkley or Dr. John Brinkley, for example, didn't count. And some people claim that many additional votes were lost during the tabulation process, saying that many legitimate ballots were tampered with or, in one case, sent down the river. Governor Woodring admitted some years later that if all the votes intended for him had been counted, Brinkley would have occupied the Kansas governor's office in 1930. As for Dr. Brinkley himself, he looked at the substantial support he'd received and resolved to try again. Brinkley did run again in 1932. This time he didn't have to overcome the obstacles of a write-in campaign. His name appeared on the ballot as the independent candidate for governor. Alf Landon entered the race as the Republican nominee, with Harry Woodring hoping to retain his position as the Democratic incumbent. Once again, Dr. Brinkley took to the campaign trail.
He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley. He's the man who's the man. He's the man who's known as Dr. Brinkley.
This song was recorded and played on radio stations across the state. It also blared from the loudspeakers of an unusual custom-built truck as it rolled into a town on the campaign trail. Brinkley called it the ammunition train because it was from this truck that he fired his rhetorical salvos against his opponents. The sides of the truck dropped down to form a platform from which speeches were delivered and live music was performed. Roy Faulkner, the popular Lonesome Cowboy from KFKB, warmed up the crowd with several tunes before the doctor appeared. Brinkley would drive into town in one of his expensive automobiles or drop out of the sky in his private airplane. And once again, William Allen White was compelled to speak out against him.
Emporia turned out to see him sitting in his circus stage, the old patent medicine man selling his bottles of political cure, all to the sick and suffering at new low prices. He talks the good old language of the circus barker and promises the dawn of a new day.
Brinkley was attacked more vehemently in a newspaper called The Pink Rag. It took direct aim at Brinkley, personally ridiculing him and making a mockery of his campaign. The Republican Party purchased large quantities of these papers and circulated them to undermine support for Brinkley. As Alf Landon put it, we had to laugh Brinkley out of that campaign, and that's what we did. Brinkley managed to poll 60,000 more votes than he had in the previous election, but it was not enough to win. Alf Landon came away with a decisive victory. As for Dr. Brinkley, William Allen White wrote a private letter to a friend saying,
"We shot the old goat's gut full of holes, and there he lies today, belly up."
Though he was defeated in the political arena, J.R. Brinkley was still very much alive. Despite the loss of his medical license, his hospital in Milford stayed in business, as Dr. Brinkley's surgeons continued to operate. And although he was forced to sell KFKB early in 1931, that didn't keep him off the airwaves for long. He built a news station in Mexico, just across the border from Del Rio, Texas.
Radio station XER in Villa Cuna became the sunshine station between the nations. Although it directed its signal to the United States, its transmissions were not subject to the regulation of the American government. Transmitting with 15 times as much power as he'd had at KFKB, Brinkley returned to the air and continued to advertise his Kansas hospital. At first, he leased long-distance telephone lines so that he could transmit from Mexico without leaving his office in Milford. Then he set up a temporary clinic in Del Rio, spending several winter months there. In the fall of 1933, Brinkley decided to move to Del Rio on a permanent basis. And while it was a sad day for Milford when the Brinkleys left, taking along a number of their hospital employees and radio performers, Del Rio was overjoyed to see the Brinkley entourage roll into town. The Brinkleys reserved space in the Roswell Hotel for their hospital business and settled into a palatial new home not far from the radio station. In addition to the performers from Milford who moved to Del Rio, Brinkley hired new personalities, such as Rosa Dominguez, the Mexican Nightingale, the Red Peppers, Melroy, the mentalist, and Rose Dawn, who offered astrological advice. Already overpowering other stations, XER boosted its power from 75,000 watts to 150,000 watts. Dr. Brinkley attracted a lot of attention to Del Rio, which he referred to as the Queen City of the Rio Grande. The Chamber of Commerce was delighted to see the extra business generated by Brinkley's presence. But his honeymoon in Del Rio was short-lived. Under pressure from the American government, Mexican authorities forced XER off the air in February of 1934, citing the station with violation of Mexican laws on medical advertisements. With the aid of his lawyers, he decided to do whatever was necessary to revive XER. And by the end of 1935, Brinkley was back on the air with a reorganized version of XER called XERA. It became the most powerful station in the world as Brinkley boosted its output to 500,000 watts. An arrangement of 3 broadcasting towers provided a directionalized signal equivalent to 1,000,000 watts, which carried far around the globe. As he had in Milford, Dr. Brinkley attracted patients to Del Rio by personally plugging his medical services on the air. By this time, however, his goat gland transplants had given way to prostate operations.
Men who have been told that their prostate gland is infected or enlarged or diseased in any way should have something done about it before structural changes have taken place, before the long continued irritation may have set up a condition of cancer in the prostate, or tuberculosis in the prostate. And we read in medical literature that cancer of the prostate in men and tuberculosis of it, these 2 conditions are on the increase.
With such words of warning, Brinkley encouraged anyone who thought they might have trouble with their prostate to come to Del Rio, where they would be attended to by Brinkley and his staff. Minnie Brinkley added her encouragement as well.
We want to invite you to come down to the Brinkley Hospital, located in the beautiful Roswell Hotel in Del Rio, Texas. Del Rio, Texas is located across from romantic Puerto Mexico. You can mix business with pleasure and come to the Brinkley Hospital for your examination. We want you to come on down to the Brinkley Hospital and have your examination. We're having beautiful weather down here. The cherry blossoms are in bloom. The pear trees are in bloom. The peach trees are in bloom. The grass is green. And we're getting flowers, and the leaves, the trees are budding. And it's spring in Del Rio, Texas. This is the home of the beautiful San Felipe Springs at the San Felipe Country Club. And you can bring the golf sticks along and play golf. We have a beautiful golf course here. You can go across the longest international bridge to Old Mexico. You can visit Mrs. Crosby's and have a good Mexican dinner. You can go to the world's most powerful broadcasting station and see the transmitter. It's a sight for anybody to see. We want you to come down to Del Rio, Texas. It's on Highway 90. It's on the Southern Pacific Railroad. It's on the Painter bus line and the Bowen bus line. And I'm here to meet you because we invite the rechecks to come back here to have their rechecks. We're delighted to have so many coming in, and we're going to be looking for you down here in Del Rio, Texas. This is Mrs. John R. Brinkley speaking to you.
He and I.
As she had in Milford, Minnie Brinkley played an active role in Del Rio.
But I had always worked with him. I worked all the time, here and everywhere. House physician, and I did, we call it the case taking. I talked to the patient, received them, and then I closed with them when they were accepted or rejected. I talked to the people, the patient.
It was truly a family business, as Brinkley's son got in on the act as well.
I used to go around at night with the night nurse, taking the pulses, temperature, and respiration. And it just tickled the dickens out of the patients that Dr. Brinkley's son was coming around taking their pulse.
Meeting the Brinkley family was a special treat for many of the patients. They'd been listening to them on the radio for years and were encouraged to feel as though they were part of the family. Little Johnny Boy was everybody's favorite. Born in 1927, he began speaking on the radio at the age of 2.
No, I never considered myself a radio personality. I was too young to think about it one way or another. I was just talking into a black box that didn't talk back. I understand I'm the first kid to ever sing Happy Birthday to You over the radio. And it usually came out, Happy Birthday to you. I couldn't pronounce you.
Now then, here's a letter from one of my patients, G.W. Roach, R-O-A-C-H, route number 4, Rusk, R-U-S-K, Texas. Dear Dr. Ms. Brinkley and son, as to recommending your treatment, I do my share. I always speak a good word for you when I get the chance. As to your treatment, I can tell the whole world you cured me once and for all. I always tell about the Brinkleys. I've lost one of my legs since I saw you, and have certainly been through the mills. You may recommend anybody to me, and I'll do the rest. From your patient and your friend, G.W. Roach, route number 4, Rusk, R-U-S-K, Texas. Now, Mr. Roach has had the misfortune to lose one of his legs. You know you just can't kill a Brinkley patient. This man had a serious accident requiring the amputation of one of his legs. But he's up and going, and I'm wondering, what about you? How long are you going to keep going? I'm getting many letters back from men. In fact, they're not coming back from the men, they're coming back from the postmaster. The men to whom I've addressed them are dead.
The brochures from Brinkley's hospital illustrated the fate of those who waited too long to come see him. According to the story of Pa and Ma, men who waited too long came home in a wooden box. But if they only listened to Dr. Brinkley and traveled to Del Rio for the operation, they would have returned home healthy and happy. Brinkley's brochures also advertised his offer to pay for a person's travel expenses as part of the $750 prostate operation. Most traveled to Del Rio by train. At one point, Brinkley hired Pinkerton agents to assure that his patients would not be diverted by another Del Rio physician who undercut Brinkley's fee for the operation.
I was aware of the fact that people were stealing his patients off the trains and everything. In fact, if you were over 50 years of age, you'd probably have 2 or 3 people contact you on the train from San Antonio to Del Rio.
Brinkley warned his incoming patients against talking to strangers, and he assured them that he offered the best services. In addition to the prostate operation, he provided treatment for piles, ruptures, and varicose veins. Although he discontinued his goat gland transplants in 1933, he replaced this operation with injections of a solution which he claimed would secure the same sexual rejuvenation. While the rest of the world suffered through the Depression, the Brinkleys continued to amass considerable wealth. The family enjoyed extended summer vacations. In 1936, they hired a filmmaker to chronicle their trip.
Well, here we are. We're coming out of the residence, and we're all set to get into the 16-cylinder Cadillac and drive to the airport. I'm waving to you, and here's Ed Rowlett of the Brinkley Rowlett Lumber Company coming around, opening the door just like he was a regular footman. And in just a moment, we're going to be off for a long 3 months cruise, and much ahead of us. That's showing our yacht at anchor down near Galveston. A few minutes you're going to see us arriving. Here we are. Yes, here we are. We're arriving. There's Miss Brinkley and Johnny Boy, and I'm trying to catch up with the procession. I'm hotter than blazes, and my blood pressure's up, and my disposition, too. And now we're underway and headed for Tampico, Mexico. Here's Mrs. Brinkley, all dressed out for the tropics, and Dr. Jones at ease. And we're underway, folks. Here's a scene along the coast of Honduras, British Honduras. And we're headed towards the Panama Canal. Here's a scene of tropical beauty as we're going up to the entrance of the canal proper. We're getting right up to Gatun Locks on the Atlantic side, and now we're in the locks. And this lock is filling so that we can be floated up and pass through. And we're now on our way, and we see the captain and the mate using the sextant, getting the position of the sun, and making their readings and calculations so that we won't miss our destination, because we're going out in that great Pacific Ocean, now 600 miles far away, and we want the nose of that old yacht pointed right on those islands so that after a 30-hour run we won't miss them. And we didn't. Here we are at Tower Island, the first of the group of the Galapagos, and look at the birds. Oh, these birds are tame. They've not been scared or killed or injured by man. I took my gun ashore. I never shot a bird. I didn't know what I was going to encounter. I'd never been on the island before, so I carried a gun for protection, but I didn't need the gun and I didn't use it. Look at these birds, how gentle they are. We're going to walk up to them. Watch me walk up to them and stick the gun barrel out to them to peck on. They will peck your finger if you stick it towards them. And here's Johnny Boy down in Elizabeth Bay standing on top of his seal that he killed. And Mama is walking around to congratulate him. And here's Daddy saying, "You are a good shot, my young fella, but I'm sorry you killed that seal." The little fella didn't know any different. And here in Elizabeth Cove, you see one of our turtles. We caught 5 of them. This fella made some delicious green turtle soup. Now here's Mrs. Brinkley and her brother and Johnny Boy and Dr. Brinkley standing on the porch of an old abandoned house, an old whaling house that was put there by Norwegians years ago for whaling purposes, but the project didn't go through, and it was a failure. The house is rotting down and falling apart. And near there we find a beautiful lake, and in this lake we see those lovely flamingos with their pink feathers and their wings edged in black. When you shoot at those flamingos, they drop and stick their heads under the water, and you think every time you fire you've killed one, but when you approach them you find that they were just using camouflage. Look at them fly away. I thought I had one, but I walked over and they flew away. But I did get one. There he is, and I really regretted it. Here's a seal. We captured this young fella, put a rope around his neck and tied him to a rock, and went ahead photographing birds, and when we came back, the seal was dead, which we regretted very much. There's one of those big lizards. They become 5 or 6 feet in length. Iguanas, they're called. We, Johnny Boy, shot quite a few of them down there. More birds, more of the same kind of scenery. I enjoyed this part of our trip as much as any of it. I didn't shoot any of these birds. You might think you would, but if you love things of nature, why, you don't use your gun. You just admire them.
Well, you do yachts like you do cars. We had 3 yachts. Somebody said, wasn't that an awful lot of yachts? And I said, well, you buy one, and then you see another one, and you can afford it, a larger one, you buy that. And in the meantime, we bought 3 yachts. And the last one was a very long, lovely yacht, and it had been built by Mr. Carl Fisher. No, we enjoyed yachting because Doctor enjoyed fishing.
We have left Nantucket and we're up to Jordan Bay, Nova Scotia. I'd rather fish around Nova Scotia than any place I've ever fished. And here we are. Look at that tuna fish. We're out after a tuna fish. And watch my pole bend and my back break. Watch that fella jerk. And how those fellows fight and how they break the fisherman's back and how they break his tackle. And Mrs. Brinkley, the mate, has come out to see the fun. You know, if you have high blood pressure or in bad shape, why, you have no business tying on to one of those fellows because you're liable to have a stroke of apoplexy and die in your fishing chair. But that would be a nice way to die. Just pass out when you was hooked onto one of those great big fellas. And here are a couple of fish. There's a world's record, folks. 2 fish caught by an angler one morning, never been duplicated. And I had the pleasure of hooking both of those big fellas and killing them one morning. And one of those fellas, I killed him in 20 minutes. That is, he was dead in 20 minutes. I think he just got scared to death and ran off and committed suicide. And there is the fish, the 788-pound tuna that broke Zane Gray's 12-year record. Folks, that's some fish. He put up some fight, and I had $1 million worth of fun. If there's any way to engage, to put a value on fun, and there's my 757-pounder. Zane Gray's was 758, and when I caught that one, I thought, uh-oh, if he could just have weighed 2 pounds more. And then I went out on August the 13th, and I caught that one weighing 788. There's a view of a 757, a 788, 525. And Mrs. Brinkley showing up in the picture, and Captain Charlie Thompson and Dr. Jones and Johnny Boy. There's the rod and the reel that did the dirty work. Look at that string of fish. I see 5 of them showing up there. Some string of fish, enough for breakfast anyway. And now we must leave. And the Lockheed Electra is arriving from Los Angeles, California. It's the first time we've seen our new ship. This is one of the most modern flying machines of today. And now we're off, and we're up 11,000 feet, 2 miles from the earth, amongst the clouds. And here's a scene inside of the cabin of the plane. Mrs. Brinkley didn't know that her picture was being taken. Now she found it out, and she's trying to look her very best. Johnny Boy is getting out of Del Rio. We have arrived at Del Rio. You saw a glimpse of his honey bear. And I'm arriving, and Mrs. Brinkley is arriving, and she's going to go right over and kiss her brother. I'm glad to see the people of Del Rio once again. Many of them were out at the airport to welcome our return home in Del Rio. I have 14 operations at the hospital awaiting me, and I don't have much time to lose. I must buckle right down and get to work.
The Brinkleys' riches accommodated a very comfortable lifestyle at their estate, which they named Palm Drive in Hudson Gardens. One Sunday in April of 1937, they opened their gates and treated more than 1,000 guests to an evening of feasting, fanfare, and fireworks. The affair left Del Rio more grateful than ever to have become home to the Brinkleys. Early in 1938, however, they shocked the community with the announcement that they were again moving their hospital. Perturbed with the Del Rio physician who was stealing his patients and upset with the community for not doing anything about it, Dr. Brinkley decided to take his business elsewhere. He purchased a hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he would continue to perform his operations. And he acquired a country club outside of town where his patients were sent to recuperate.
I know you realize we're busy, have much work to do, trying to do a good job on the broken down pieces of humanity that comes to see us. We have our cases, I might say, are the most advanced. You people have stayed away from me, many of you, until you are physical wrecks. You can never be made whole. The best we'll be able to do for many of you will be to patch you up and give you less freedom from pain and suffering than you've had heretofore. If I could get you people to obey my instructions as I give them to you over the radio, come in time, come before great structural changes have taken place in your body, before valuable and vital organs have broken down, we could accomplish so much more for you and do so much more for you.
Each week, Brinkley flew to Little Rock to operate, returning to his home in Del Rio on the weekend. To the dismay of Del Rio residents, his talks on XERA now ended with a call for prospective patients to visit the world's most beautiful hospital in Little Rock.
I'm going to read to you a letter from one of my patients, S.A. Carter, 911 Bell Avenue in Caruthersville, Missouri. He says, my family doctor told me he couldn't do anything for me because of my bad prostate and was going to send me to Memphis to have it cut out. But I thought I'd better go to the Brinkley Hospital. I went there on November 28, 1937. I was so sick, I didn't know whether or not I was going to get there alive. Well, doctor, I got better in 3 days and have been getting better all the time. I eat all I want, sleep like a baby, and work every day. So I think the Brinkley Hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas is the place for sick people to go. Many of you come to us when all the working parts of your body are broken down and destroyed. If you'd come to us in time, as I tell you, you could go forth radiantly happy and radiantly healthy and feel as beautiful as these flowers look beautiful to us as we see them in this colored picture. Contemplate these things and see how much time you've wasted. Valuable time that can never be given back to you again. See the happiness and the health you've missed by your procrastination and your delay. When you get back home, why don't you tell your neighbors and your friends to not wait like you've waited, to not delay coming to see us like you have, but to come before they get into condition that you're now in. You remember the sayings I've said to you over the radio about the young man traveling along the road and coming aside the elderly man who said to him, remember, man, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. So prepare to follow me.
The facilities in Little Rock soon filled with patients, and Dr. Brinkley appeared to be establishing a strong base for continuing his medical career. His techniques, however, continued to draw fire, most consistently from his old nemesis Morris Fishbein. Fishbein published an article in Hygeia magazine in which he called Brinkley a quack. Dr. Brinkley responded with a libel suit against Fishbein, which came to trial in Del Rio in March of 1939.
He was very much aware of the fact that he was a maverick in the medical profession, and he couldn't care less. But my father's policy was keep the AMA so tied up in lawsuits they couldn't stop him from working. And that's what he did. Every time they published an article in Hygeia or the Journal, he'd file another lawsuit. And I guess they were all consolidated into this one trial.
After a week-long trial, which focused mainly on Dr. Brinkley and his medical career, the jury returned a verdict in favor of Morris Fishbein. Dr. Brinkley could indeed be legally referred to as a quack. That verdict prompted a series of lawsuits to be initiated against Dr. Brinkley by former patients. These suits, many of which were settled out of court, cost the doctor as much as $1 million. At about the same time, the Brinkleys received a bill from the IRS for $450,000 in back taxes. With his back against the wall, Dr. Brinkley lashed out at the communist movement in America, possibly hoping to divert attention from his personal predicament.
Many believe that there is an organized force back of the Depression, conspiring to keep the ship of state sailing towards the rocks. I am one of that number. There is a world communist movement directed and financed by some powerful force, stronger financially and otherwise than the radical gangs that have been pushed to the front to do the dirty work. That force supplies the cash to buy newspaper correspondents, control moving picture producers, and put speakers on the radio. There is every reason to believe that such a power exists, and that it is working secretly with labor agitators to keep industry demoralized and bring despair to the working people. The aim is to make soldiers for the revolution.
Besides trying to keep the communists out of America, Brinkley tried to keep America out of the Second World War. Some of his talks echoed the isolationist sentiments of the pre-war era, when Britain was already at war with Germany.
War is the world's most damnable racket, and those who want to get into it for any purpose except defense are racketeers. The American path of duty starts at his feet and ends at our border. It can be reached without crossing the ocean, and it can be traveled without shedding blood. I witnessed men getting ready for battle. I saw many march away in the last war to die for a shibboleth that didn't mean anything. They got worked into a frenzy and became restless when the drums beat and the flag fluttered in the sunlight. They seem always ready to rush into battle to shoot and bayonet and kill. Oh, God, I don't know why.
Whereas some would consider such talk that of a pacifist, others called it un-American. After his name was brought up in a congressional hearing on un-American activities, Brinkley restrained his anti-war rhetoric. Sensing that war was imminent, he bought a vocational training school for aviation mechanics in Kansas City. Brinkley advertised the school daily on XERA, stressing the fact that mechanics would not be directly involved in the fighting. As a major selling point, the school guaranteed jobs for its graduates. With evidence to the contrary, the Better Business Bureau soon put a stop to the ads, and the school was forced to close when the Kansas Corporation Commission determined that Brinkley had been mishandling the school's assets. On another front, Brinkley transferred ownership of his Little Rock facilities to one of his doctors and returned to Del Rio, saying that he was being hit with too many lawsuits in Arkansas. Del Rio welcomed his return, but Brinkley's plans to reestablish his hospital there were upset by a growing mountain of debts. He sold his yacht and his airplane, and then, early in 1941, he filed for bankruptcy. Soon after this, Dr. Brinkley was dealt a more crushing blow when the Mexican authorities ordered XERA off the air.
Our broadcasting station across the river, XERA, was closed. And he'd go down and he'd talk to the officials. It had been closed on other occasions. And he'd go down, talk to the officials, and settle with them and, get them, and get it back on the air after a while. So this time he went down, the last time he went down, he had negotiated and attended to the business and was coming home. And it was in July, hot weather most everywhere, and the altitude in Mexico City is 7,000 feet to start with. So the plane just took off and just kept going up and up and up to get altitude because of the heat, I suppose. And he had a heart block in the plane.
Brinkley survived this attack, but a few months later, doctors in Kansas City amputated one of his legs when a blood clot from his heart broke loose and blocked an artery. While he was still in the hospital, a U.S. Marshal arrived to present the Brinkleys with a warrant charging them with mail fraud in connection with the last shipment of promotional material sent from Little Rock. With the case scheduled to come to trial in the spring of 1942, the Brinkleys returned to Texas. Several months of painful bed rest followed, leaving the doctor depressed and incapacitated. At the same time, he was making plans for yet another comeback.
While he was bedridden, he took mail order lessons to be a minister. And he figured that what he'd be able to do would be buy time on the radio and do what Billy Graham is doing today.
Dr. Brinkley's plans to become an ordained minister did not materialize, nor did his hopes to return to the radio. His health continued to deteriorate, and at the age of 56, he passed away. His death came on May 26th of 1942, the day the mail fraud trial was scheduled to convene.
Well, friends, I guess you can see there's quite a diversity of entertainment on this program. I believe in kind of mixing up a little bit, but now the time has come for a lovely hymn. And here's a good one. You all remember, work for the night is coming. Work for the night is coming. Work through the morning hours. Work while the dew is falling. Work is bringing flowers. Work when the day grows brighter. Work in the glowing sun. Work for the night is coming. When man's work is done.
After Dr. Brinkley died, Mrs. Brinkley received a suspended sentence on the mail fraud charges. She remained at the estate in Del Rio, sharing it in her later years with her granddaughter Angela. Johnny lived nearby, preferring not to live in the mansion. He developed skills as a photographer, but bouts with alcoholism sapped his spirit and he resorted to an act of suicide in 1976. Minnie Brinkley passed away in 1980 at the age of 87.
I went to see my Cindy, she met me at the door. She was in stockings in her hand and her feet all over the floor.
I went to see my Cindy, for pleasure I was seeking. I missed the mouth and kissed the nose, and the doggone thing was leaking.